Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about some advice for people who want to get into making swords from various backgrounds. And now I shall introduce myself to get an idea of the perspective I'm coming from. So I'm Jonathan, also known as the medieval Genie. I'm someone who has a background in something called historical European martial arts. So I do martial arts involving swords and doing sword fighting and looking at how people presumably used to fight with swords historically. And I've also been dabbling, I've done a couple of short courses in blacksmithing and bladesmithing, and I've also experimented in making swords, including a couple I've made. If you're really interested in seeing my work, then I've done other videos test cutting and showing the blades that I've made previously, but I don't want to get into, showing off and all that. I'm just here to talk more about the stuff. So, that's why I'm holding this. I'm not actually going to use the hammer, just showing a blacksmith thing. So anyway, because I didn't plan this in advance. So today we're going to be looking at a sword that I have not yet made and a sword that I have already made, and I'll just show them now in my magic editing tricks. You'll see that they're already coming up to actually quite long. The blade that I've already made, so I shall come back to this. This is my first ever successfully created sword. This is a design of a Langsax. It's technically not historically accurate because it has a full tang design, as you'll see here. So you've got these three copper pins. So you've got this metal sandwiched in between the two layers of wood. In this case, ash, which I've then just varnished for aesthetics and durability because I handle this a lot. So then you've got the second item, which is going to be also a Langsax, basically the same design as the old ones I've already made, but this one I've barely started on. I've done a bit of the tang and a little bit of the tip to get just the most basic shape, and the rest is completely unforged. The only thing I did was, it used to be a piece of a leaf spring from a car. It's the same material as I used to make the first sword, and it starts out curved because of what it used to be. So I just straightened it out gently, and apart from that, what you're seeing in the middle, you've got the grey dark effect of the forge scale, but actually it's barely been touched in terms of actual hammering and stuff. So that's just the stuff I'm going to be demonstrating with today. So let's talk about some tips, like I said. So one of the things to bear in mind is when you're making the sword, you should try to focus on the handling characteristics and the way that it chops, in a way that you should look at it differently to how you might see movie depictions of swords. So we should talk about the design before we even talk about the physical making of one. So often in movies, swords are depicted as these really heavy, bulky, smashing, blunt instrument types of items, when really they are designed to be sharp. You need to think of them less as baseball bats in a wedge section, and think more of them along the lines of something like a kitchen knife, but with a great reach. So you don't see chefs smacking pieces of meat until they fall apart. You see them carefully slice along with push and pull cuts to then cut gently and easily through the meat. It's the same thing with a sword. So to achieve that, yes, you do want some heft and chop. Now, the typical approach to this is make it heavier, because of course something that's heavier hits harder. It's the same principle as any blacksmith will understand with their hammers. This one is, what, £2 head? If I want something that hits harder and I don't want to tire my arm swinging so hard, why don't I get a £3 hammer? And then it's a heavier weight, it hits harder. But as much as that does factor in, the weight of a sword works to a certain degree. Obviously, the heavier something is, the more tiring it is to use it. And this can sometimes be a bit neglected, especially considering how, in some cases, blacksmiths gain a lot of arm strength, and it's quite specialised, whereas there's a lot of speed and manoeuvring and other factors involved with swordsmen, the actual intended users of your swords, even if you're making it for yourself. So instead of trying to make a sword heavier, which could potentially slow it down and make it cumbersome, for example, you see, if you've ever seen task cutting or actual actors in movies using heavy recreations of swords, you'll often see a lot of overswing, which is very bad. So instead of, let's say I'm going to do a diagonal chop, so from my upper right to lower left, what I should do is I get my sword ready. I'm not going to go into stances and all that, I've talked about in other videos, but I've got my ready position. I then decide I'm going to cut and then I chop. It's simple stuff. With these recreations, however, you see something a lot more like that. The sword, you're not so much controlling the sword as the sword itself is taking you on a journey. It's not a good thing. So instead, if you want more heft and more chop in a sword, that's fine. You want it to have authority and presence when you're fighting with it or doing test cutting or whatever you intend, even if it's something that's never gonna fly off come off a shelf and be used physically and it's just something for decoration. In the design you should still have it look right. So the sort of feeling, the tactile experience you should get from your sword is one where you've actually got more forward weight. Think the same way as your hammer. If I take this piece of metal, which is not quite a couple of pounds, but if I took this and I used it as the hammer at the forge, everyone knows, blacksmith or not, if I was swinging this as the hammer, it's not going to have as much of an impact as the same weight concentrated in a hammerhead. This same principle, however, seems to be neglected when it applies to swords. So you'll see some designs, especially things like the falcata, the kukri, other certain weapons where it's the most clearly so, and you actually see them with flared bits towards the tip, or certain designs of Celtic swords, if you want a double-edged example. The swords can sometimes narrow gradually. If you're looking at something like the longer versions of the Cinque Dea and those sorts of things, you'll see a sword that starts very broad and then it gradually tapers towards the tip. Obviously that triangulation and gradual tapering is great for stabbing something, but for cutting, the opposite is better. So it's actually might have a width, it might have a wasp waist, or maybe just start narrower and then gradually flare out. And that provides the best chopping power. Now, you can't have a sword that's great at everything, so this is where the compromise comes in. So you look at something like this, Langsax, obviously it does not flare out as much. It's got its weight in the blade, and I'll talk more about how to stop the counterbalancing from being a problem in a minute. So with this, it's got a good bit of thickness, and it does have what's called a distal taper. Now, to anyone who's not experienced at bladesmithing or such things, distal taper, if I show you closer with my sword, I'm putting an edge on my hand here, it'll be a bit difficult to see in the light, but it starts out thicker, and then as it heads towards the tip, it gets thinner. Now, this is a design a bit like on bows that you shoot with, as opposed to bows that you tie and all that. So the design is that because it starts thicker towards the hand and then it gets thinner, what happens is it flexes better. So that's something else that should be noted. I'll talk more about flex later. But in terms of weight distribution, this doesn't have as much of a taper because I wanted it to keep more weight further forward in the blade. So some of them have a much more distinct and extreme taper. This one's kept I've got it that it has a little bit more taper, more suddenly, in the last 3 inches or something, right where the stabbing happens. But bearing in mind I'm not a psychopath, I just cut plastic bottles and things. Anyway, so there's that thickness taper which happens in this last bit, but for most of the way, the gradual reduction of the thickness is very gradual, because I did want it to not snap in half or fold, but I did want it to still have the degree where it can take that impact. So I'm chopping, maybe I'm hitting something hard like a block of wood or bone or something, and it ends up maybe needing to wobble and flex a little bit before springing back into position. So I don't want it to break, but the compromise is I don't let it taper too extremely. And you even see some designs of blades, especially of the thicker ones, where you can hardly notice or not see any distal taper at all. And this changes the weight. So the breadth that you're seeing here, apart from these bits obviously for the tip, the rest of it is pretty much the same breadth. However, because the thickness is different, it changes the weight distribution. So you should always bear that in mind, that you do usually want some slight taper in the thickness. But again, with something like a flaring, like on the falcata that I've got, that I've used in test cutting videos, you can still have it with more weight towards the tip, with that kind of broadening. Or at the very least, you can keep it fairly, you know, the same sort of breadth like you see in a lot of, for example, medieval arming swords, and then it suddenly taper in its breadth towards the tip. That can also keep a good bit of weight far forward, which means when I chop with this sword, it's still got enough authority and enough heft that it is still going to have a good impact. So that's something else to bear in mind. Now, if you're someone who's used to making knives, you're a bladesmith in that sense, and you're just wanting to move up to swords, you should always bear in mind that as much as the wood and those sorts of materials, carbon fibre, micarta, zirconium, those sorts of things that you use for handles, or you know, whether it's something like a full tang or a sort of a rat tail tang, or whatever design you're having to attach a handle to your sword, that type of material has a lot less of an effect on a sword than it does on a knife. Now if you're looking at something like, let's say, a 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch blade, yes, something like a bulky piece of wood can completely change the handling dynamics. So if I grab this knife, which is actually one that I just found, this knife was, you know, I can feel that it's got, if I try to balance it on my finger, it's trying to drop off handle side. I can barely keep it in my finger, so its point of balance is somewhat in the hand. So if I wish to cut with this, I'm feeling most of the force stays in my hand, whereas I've got an even thicker and bulkier grip in this sword, and you'll notice, a bit similar to certain designs like a yataghan, I've actually got it flare out at the bottom to act in the same way as a pommel. It stays in the hand much more snugly and doesn't want to fly out. But yet, despite this, it does barely anything to the weight. It's the changing of scale. You should never think of a sword as a knife, but you know, bigger, because actually you shouldn't go too much into the thickness. That should stay sometimes a bit similar to a lot of knives, especially if you're used to making things like the Bowie knives and hunting knives and those thicker chopping blades. You might already have the correct thickness, and you shouldn't go any further than that, or else you'll make an overweight, bulky blade. And additionally, you shouldn't think of it as scaling up in terms of things like the breadth as well. I do see that sometimes when people try to scale up from knife making into sword making. It's problematic. You should ideally, if you want something that chops nicely, so you've got a certain material, you want to stretch it out, you want to get it into a blade, rather than trying to make it wider, yes, that can make a good chopping blade for its length. But if you're not so worried about the sort of space it's fitting in, you know, let's say you're allowing it up to a certain length, like this is a 20-inch blade, maybe a 24-inch, 27-inch, 32-inch blade like a cavalry sabre, then instead of looking at making it broader and shorter, I would recommend you should have it a similar sort of breadth to those knives, but make it longer. And again, with things like the distal taper and features like that, and of course good tempering in the heat treatment, it won't break or anything, it won't be fragile if it's narrow. Bearing in mind, you can have certain designs like the small sword, which are short, yes, but if you look at how thin they are, they're very narrow. I'll show you a picture of a small sword now. So it's a very thin, well, it's got some thickness to make it stiff, but it is comparatively not too thick, and yet it's extremely narrow, and yet despite this, it is considered a suitable and handy blade. It was used in duels, it was used in self-defense, maybe might have even been used on the battlefield, And these are very narrow blades, so they can clearly hold their own, even without too much breadth. But of course, in the case of a small sword, that's designed for stabbing. This, of course, will be something more for chopping. So, yeah, instead of having it broader, because of, like I said, the weight distribution and forward weight which helps in a chop, and it's that, I'm not an expert in physics, but it's something in terms of leverage and all that, that the longer your blade, the more you can chop. So instead of having it, the same weight, let's say 2 pounds or 3 pounds in weight, whatever you want to do, maybe in kilograms instead of having it broader, have it longer. This comes on to my next point, which is when you're making a sword, if you're going into blade smithing, so we're not talking about stock removal, we're talking about blacksmithing. Now I should clarify this for people who don't know so much. Stock removal is where you're doing cutting, grinding, filing and sanding to make the item, which of course is, as the namesake, stock removal. You are taking a shape and size of metal already, and then you're removing material. Think of it like shaving wood or carving stone, until you've got the shape and size of item that you want. Blacksmithing is different. So when you're making a sword, when you're doing sword smithing most especially, I've always said, this is the first time on video at least, I always say don't go by size, go by weight. So I find if you want a certain weight of sword, like say a couple of pounds or something, you start from that. So you start from something that's not too heavy, not too light, something that's sort of slightly above the weight, because you'll need to do some polishing and grinding for the final touches. And if you're less experienced at blacksmithing, you might want to do, this is something I'd recommend for people who are newer to this, you can do a little bit of half and half. So you do the blacksmithing to make a lot of the shape, but then maybe you're not so confident it will be perfect on blacksmithing, so you can do less of it in the stretching the material and shaping it in the forge, and then you can just spend the time you need gently and just grind it to the correct sort of edge bevel and all of those nice bits like I've done on this. This one had a lot of grinding on it, and I did a video on the first version of this same sword, and I was dissatisfied because it was too thick and the edge wasn't cutting properly. So I actually did more grinding and a significant amount of material came off in the end. So that shows that you don't necessarily have to go whole hog for stock removal or blacksmithing. You can kind of mix it up, and I'd recommend it. But yeah, when you're starting, have something slightly heavier than the final weight of the sword that you want, and then you start, doing the blacksmithing and then the grinding and things as you need afterwards, rather than trying to look at the correct size, because you might end up with a sword, you might end up miscalculating and ending up making a sword that's a bit too light and short, or you might end up even making a sword that's overweight and getting so overzealous that you end up with a very stocky blade, like I did with this one, my first attempt, and it ends up just being almost like an axe with a knife shape. It doesn't feel like a sword anymore. So apart from that, the next thing I'd say is when you're doing a sword, especially since you're going to be playing with a lot of material, and hopefully I would like to see trying to stretch and get a good decent blade length out of it. Even if you've got a small amount of material and you're only able to get a shorter sword blade. Like when I made that short sword, I had a sort of a remaining piece of material. I wanted to make something and it looked like cracks. Anyway, so I had a piece that wasn't too big, and I ended up trying to stretch it into a short sword and made it something like a 15-inch blade, 16-inch, something like that. But I tried to stretch as much of it into a decent blade as I could. And again, that extra length helped, and it made it a nicer blade than it would have been otherwise. Now, when forging these sorts of swords, because there is that desire to stretch and start with the material, this will probably sound obvious to people who've already done bladesmithing with knives, but I always would recommend that you start, and as I've done actually with this, you always start with the tang before you do anything else, because if you want a certain blade length and you haven't got quite as much material as you thought you did, or the worst thing that happens is you end up with a bit of a shorter sword, or maybe it has a bit more of a pointy tip and it stabs better than it cuts, and it's not quite the way you're expecting it and wanting it to go. It's a more minor thing. Whereas if you're forging out the blade and you make the mistake of leaving the tang part until later, this can be a serious problem in that you might end up with a short tang that's more likely to fly out. You might end up with a weak tang that actually is going to potentially break or bend during usage. Other things like that. It can be a problem. Or you're even sort of eating away into the sword's blade material and it can end up looking a bit janky. So I can't swing this too hard because I've got too little material in the tang at the moment. I'll put just a little bit more, but since I can't swing it too enthusiastically, it'll probably slide out of my hand and destroy the world. But another useful thing about starting with the tang, especially on full tang blades like I'm using here, that I tend to swear by, but I've experimented with, the stick kind of tangs as well. It's quite useful also if you're just particularly doing it across multiple days. You can get a feel for the sword that you're making. So I did this repeatedly with this sword that I was making. I do it with every sword that I make. I never just make the item, fit it all together, and I've done a whole lot, and then I pick it up for the first time and I don't know how it feels. I've been handling this thing like it's my wife the entire time. I've been taking the bits of metal and tapering it out, and I think, this feels like it's going to slide out my hand. So on examples like this one, I decided to give it a bit more of a curve forward. I also thought, it's going to help, but I do want to make sure it stays in the hand, so I gave it that flared handle. I'd never even seen swords like yataghans before. I didn't even know that was a commonly done thing for certain designs, but I just thought I wanted it to be broader and thicker at the bottom. I wanted it to curl forwards a bit in the handle, so that it would stay better, and so you could feel that security when you swing it around, because there's nothing worse than a sword that obviously it feels good if a sword chops right and it does the stabbing right and it does all those functional things, but it also needs to feel good. I've always, a lot of things I always do, but this is the first time on video, I call swords a sort of tactile art. So the handling it doesn't just need to physically slice through things and pierce through things, it does also need to handle in a way that you almost want to hold it, and that's one of the reasons why I like this sword so much. That I'm in my room and I've got a sheath and I'm trying to be careful because I'm not very good at leather working. It's my first attempt at sheath, and I'm trying not to cut the thing open from repeatedly. I'm putting the sword back so it looks nice and it's got that appearance because it's cool. I've made it in an Anglo-Saxon design all by myself, amazing. But then I just want to take it out again and swing it at stuff. It's not a burglar in my house, or I'm not doing any test cutting, but I just want to take this sword and handle it, And that, like I say, is a sign that I like the design. Hang on. I just heard a little bit of a rattle. I'll need to check that later. It's been handled a lot and it's done a lot of test cutting and chopping, so it's lasted a good long while anyway, certainly years. But yes, when I have these swords, it's a bit of a habit from autism that I do all the spins like that a lot, but I do want to actually handle the blades and see how they are if I'm wielding them, and when it's a good result, it's almost a desire. It's kind of like addictive drugs. You start once and then you want to go again and again. That is how you know you've got a decent sword. And going back to making a sword, this should start to come out as you're making it. So I feel at the moment when I'm handling this, like I said, I don't want to swing it too enthusiastically because it might fall out of my hand. So I'm thinking, yes, I could have a design similar to this. So if it's going to be not so forward curved like I've done on this handle, I want to keep it more straight and sort of medieval looking, then I'll think I might want to thicken it at the bottom, same as I did with this one, so that it stays better in the hand. Or I might be thinking, even as I hold this, I notice with certain cuts, because you're not robotic and you don't sort of chop like that, this is why I'd recommend learning sword fighting while you're learning to make the swords as well. When you're fighting with swords, you don't sort of have your hand stiff and then go, like you're some sort of mechanical robot or an action figure. You're putting things like your wrist into it as well. And I notice whenever I do these sorts of cuts and I'm extending properly, kind of like casting out a fishing rod, I describe cuts as, I feel that this part back here is trying to dig into my hand. And I think that although when I hold it in a hammer grip, if you look here, there's a tiny bit of the tang sticking out the bottom. And even if I don't completely choke up to where the blade starts, there's still a little bit of the tang poking out the bottom. So if I just pick this up, I'm a blacksmith, and I think, okay, I pick this up, you know, does it fit in a hand? Yes, it's the right kind of shape and size to fit in my hand, so I'm satisfied. As much as I don't recommend making sword handles too long, because it's a bit of a waste and it doesn't look realistic, and certain things like pommels, if they fit tighter to the hand, they have a bit more of an influence, so you can do certain leverage and chops better, especially on designs like Viking, Saxon types of swords, which do that more deliberately with tight handles. But I feel with this one, maybe it's something that's a bit rough on the corner, so I need to make it a bit rounder. It's almost kind of like what they do with the pistol grips, as they're called, on things like certain swords. You know, military sabers had a bit more of a pistol grip going on. Certain designs of other items, I mean, the historical pistols themselves have that curling. So I could do that, and again, I just need to make sure it's thicker on, you know, on this axis, the actual thickness, so it stays in the hand. But on the actual front and back, I can sort of curl it over. So then when I do that leverage and a cut, I don't every time feel it's digging into me. And it doesn't help that because I've been doing so much blacksmithing, I've been, well, you know, working on this blade and some other items. I'm already starting to get a sore patch, and if I keep swinging this and it's got this same handling as before, it's going to turn into a blister. Now, it should go without saying that if you've got a sword that gives you a blister, you're either wielding it so badly because you're putting a death grip on it that you're just a bad swordsman and maybe need to relax a bit more, or it is because of something like the design in the sword is uncomfortable. So this is again why I'd like people to try handling their swords, and you can't get as much of a feel for it when you're using something like a, you know, rod, sort of stick tang or partial tangs or those sorts of designs, as much as you can with the ones I swear by, the full tangs, but you can still get an idea, although you need to be careful, of course, not to throw it out of your hands and hurt somebody or destroy things. You can still get a bit of a feel, even if you don't swing it, you can get a feeling for the general dynamics. Does it feel forward heavy? Does it feel a bit too much like the force stays in your hand? I'm feeling at the moment this is more kind of a bit of both. I'm feeling like there's a bit more weight heading towards the bottom of the blade, so as a sword fighter, I should go more about how my sword fighting knowledge informs my sword making knowledge. If there's more weight towards the bottom, it can be very authoritative in a bind. So if there's another sword, I'm going to use the spine, I don't want to damage the edge, and we're doing this, it's kind of like in the movies when swords bind up like this and we're going "Rrr," and all that. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about bind. So when you're parrying and trying to stop another person from hitting you, usually parry in this part called the forte, the bottom half of the sword. So if there's more authority and there's more weight down here towards the bottom, it does help so I can keep a firm, strong parry. If I want it to chop better, I actually want that weight a bit further forward. I'm not wanting it to specialise in either, I want it to have a good handling, so kind of like this one really. It's got a bit of weight towards the bottom, maybe a bit too much for my liking, but it means that it's good and strong, so if hypothetically I did use this in sword fighting for realsies, with this weight further to this sort of weight here in the bottom half, the forte, it means that when I'm parrying, instead of being sort of easily moved, although a lot of sword fighting is structuring your body, so even if you've got a fairly lightweight sword that is weaker in the bind, you can still parry very effectively, so it doesn't make it impossible to use the sword. But, you know, real life isn't like in drills and martial arts techniques and things. You're usually sort of more improvised, so you could, in a drill, have a perfect parry, so with pretty much any sword you can do a decent parry. But with a sword that's got more weight in its bottom half, it's more forgiving. You put the sword there, and even if you've put a bit less structure, you haven't positioned yourself properly, and it's sort of springing inwards a bit, there's less give, so you're less likely to get sort of, you know, if this is an inside parry that's called in military sabre, and of course if I give too much, you know, you'll see from the camera's perspective, if I give too much, there's this part of my body that's exposing itself to an attack. So if I'm doing a parry and it fails, maybe I'm very late, so I'm just barely out in time, if it's positioned badly and it's a sword that doesn't accept the parry as nicely, it can start to come in, and I receive, even if not as strong a cut or thrust as before, it still is going to injure me through that parry, which I don't really want. So, something with a bit more of an authority down here in the lower half, looking at my falcata, it would be a lot weaker in that type of binding action, whereas this sword I'd be extremely confident in. I'd only be worrying about my hands because there's no crossguard or basket hilt to protect it. But actually parrying in the blade itself, I'd be quite confident in this. Now, more obviously and conversely, if you want it to have a bit better of an authority in beating someone's sword aside, yes, it does help to have weight forwards, but also certain actions, it actually helps not just to have that extreme, you know, flaring or thickness in the sort of last third. I'd actually recommend that you also keep it with a good degree of chopping ability, actually all the way through to about halfway along the blade. Because tip cuts, if you're doing things like test cutting, or you're doing things like sparring and fighting, and you're a bit more of a distance keeper like me, I'm known in fighting as the hand carver because I target hands and forearms quite a lot, and I'm cutting closer towards the tip. In general, your cuts tend to be a bit closer, you know, they can be right at the tip, further towards the sweet spot, or maybe to about halfway down. So it's good to make sure that your sword doesn't just chop beautifully in the last few inches of the blade, that it cuts, like I said, down to about halfway along. And this is also good for test cutting as well. Even if, you know, you're quite experienced at test cutting, even if you don't really, you know, you're hoping to cut towards the tip more, I find that you can end up cutting a bit closer to the halfway down the blade, especially if you've got a broader target and you want to chop all the way through, and a draw cut. So more of a leverage chopping cut. The blade is more straight, so I'm going like this, and I use my wrist to leverage it through. This is part of, again, sword fighting and test cutting technique, so I'm leveraging it. But if you're doing more of a draw cut, especially if you've got a really sharp blade and you want to let everyone know that your sword you've made is sharp, draw cuts are beautiful for this. So instead of leveraging it, which tends to make the forward weight and the general overall weight bring itself to bear, the sharpness is brought to bear more by doing something more like a draw cut. So instead of chopping through like that, I'm slicing through like that. I am still using my wrist, by the way. I'm exaggerating by not moving my wrist, but an actual cut, you still use your wrist to handle it. Just a little side note. So, like I said, with those sorts of things, whether it's a chopping cut or more of a draw cut, I would recommend having it do decent cutting for at least half of the blade. So that's another thing as well. And one of the things that caught me out when I did test cutting of my first sword was indeed the fact that there were certain areas down to about halfway down that it didn't cut well. It seemed like if I was cutting towards the tip, I'd go wah, and it would go through nicely. Whereas if I wanted to do a proper hefty cut and I wanted to put the force in, and I wanted to power through, especially with footwork, so I'm stepping across the target, I found it would actually struggle and it would start to bounce the bottle a little bit because its cutting down to about halfway down was not as good. Its forward weight actually can sometimes take away from cutting in the middle of the blade if it's flared out, but also things like the thickness. But it's important to have the sharpness and the edge bevels and all that good for that far. So that's another thing to bear in mind as well. Something you wouldn't use in test cutting that is more like a, dueling, real-life fighting type of thing that you might want to have on your swords is also a good degree of sharpness pretty much the entire way down until you meet, unless either the entire way down the blade if you're using that type of sword, or if you've got something called a ricasso, which is a deliberately blunt section. Ricasso is really good for parrying because edge-on-edge parrying, obviously you get chips and dings out of the sword. A ricasso is just a bar, it can take it and not care. Anyway, either down to the ricasso or down the entire way down the blade, you should have a good degree of sharpness. So then if you were doing certain closer actions for cuts, that would help as well. So the sort of thing where this might have happened, represented in manuscripts historically for duels and battle situations or whatever, is if people get really close and they're doing that kind of stuff like the binding again, or maybe they're charging in after a parry, or just immediately charging the target. So they're getting into a grappling situation where you can reach each other with your own arms, and then you're perhaps manipulating around, and then you're able to reach the target with the edge, but you don't really have the room. I'm maybe around here, next to maybe around here, or let's say, let me remember an actual example. Okay, so person's trying to thrust at me or trying to do a cut, or even I'm just binding up with them, and then I go around with my pommel, or around with the handle. I then bring it down so their blade is about here, leverage it, keep my hand on top of them because I don't want them to move because they'll do something like cut me or stab me. So while I'm controlling them, I could try to perhaps distance myself, maybe they align and stab me while I'm trying to do all this, and it's kind of awkward and I want to do something immediately. So I've got enough room, I've got my sword ready, I can go to about here. Maybe it's a bit of a chop, but realistically it's not going to be as powerful, especially if they're trying to close up to me, because grappling, usually people ending up in grappling distance, they're practically hugging each other, and with some actual martial arts techniques. I remember this one guy said for doing things like hip throws, including with swords, his hips, my hips, they meet. If you can fit a credit card between you, you're doing it wrong. So yes, if we're in a distance where we can't even fit a credit card between us, then obviously it's not a good distance for a proper swing. So at that point I'd be placing it around somewhere like their neck, for example, and then I can do a draw cut. So that ability to slice, this is going back to the kitchen knife type of thing again. A sword shouldn't just be something that swings, that it chops, thinking like an axe taking down a tree. It should also slice. Think about cutting through a loaf of bread, making slices, or cutting up steaks, or things like that. Cutting up meat and other items using not a chopping action, but a slicing action. A sword, any decent sword, should be able to chop and slice. There are very few designs in the world that would exclusively have a sword doing the chop or the slice. There might be some examples and people might comment about it, but in a grand majority of cases, any sword that you've made well should cut in a chop and it should cut in a fine slice. It should do both. And to some degree, when using and doing sword fighting, whether it's against test cutting or a live opponent, usually it never really completely specialises the action in one or the other anyway. When you're cutting someone with a sword or cutting a target that's inanimate with a sword, you're doing a little bit of both in the same action. So if you look at my test cutting or anyone's test cutting videos, usually they're not doing something that is just 100% chop or just 100% slice, unless it's a very specific demonstration. Look, here's the target, whoosh, look at how great it is sort of thing. It's actually more like, any actual realistic hitting a target type of representation. it's a little bit of slice, a little bit of chop, all kind of melded into a decent sword fighting cut. And I've talked a lot about cuts, also with thrusts. You should bear in mind that the edge slice, the actual sharpness on the edge, can factor in. So the narrower the blade, the easier it goes in, of course. But I find if you start with a really narrow tip and then it's very broad later on, like has happened to a degree with this one, it can sometimes end up getting stuck. Now, there are ridiculous myths about this blood groove, and it's there because there's a vacuum, and having a channel along your blade lets the blood down. It's shit, okay? Don't listen to them. A little side note, fullering is actually there to lighten it. Think, instead of a massive block of iron, you think of those I or H-shaped beams used in construction. You've got the sturdiness of something bigger, but it's still light, and you're not using too much material. It's that principle. So that's just a little note, and you should use that with swords as well. So if you want it to be very broad, which gives it that aerodynamic and the chopping juice in action, but you don't want it too heavy, things like fullering can help. And then you don't necessarily need to make it very thin and floppy as a blade and potentially wobble if an imperfect cut happens, or on the bounce after a hit. But anyway, going back to the structuring of a blade, when you've got the actual thrusting action happening, what actually causes a blade to get stuck is either you meet something like, getting stuck inside a wooden shield, getting stuck inside someone's armour, or getting stuck into something like bone. But the main reason why a sword gets stuck on a thrust, particularly against non-human targets, is that the blade has too much thickness, or too much breadth, or other things later on. So you can have the finest point where I could just tap the edge like that, and I'm bleeding out my finger, but yet if it's too thick and broad later on, it kind of only penetrates the target so far and it gets stuck. But also can make it a bit more difficult to retract the blade, because not this sort of vacuum pulling in, it's just basic friction against your target. Now, if you have an edge, usually when a pierce happens, it's never an exact machine engineering perfect, here's the straight line from A to B. Human motion is not quite like that. So that imperfection actually is a good thing in a fight, or in test cutting. So with that, if you've got a sharp edge, most especially a double edge, which can even just be, like you see on certain designs of military sabre, only for a certain way down the back of the blade and the rest is just a proper spine. If you've got that double edge, or even a sharp enough front edge only, then as you're doing the thrust, the imperfection of the human motion actually cuts the target as it thrusts. It's not something that will, it could cause a more severe sort of, injury or damage to a target, but additionally, it makes it very easy to retract the blade back out again, because instead of it being a perfect hole, like you've got a round stake with a spike on, and you're puncturing in, and then it gets kind of stuck and difficult to pull out, because it's a round hole pushing in, and then there's the friction of everything surrounding it trying to resist. You have instead got that as you're puncturing into your desired target, it causes cutting either on one or both edges as the penetration happens. And not only does this make a more, a clearer, more severe sort of damage or injury to the target, but it additionally sort of makes a larger opening than the actual sword is. So let's say I've cut and maybe I've gone up slightly, or like that forward slightly, there's something in this wobble, so it's caused the edge on this langsax to cut the hole. So I'm thrusting in, it should be about, this, maybe that much of an entry, but then because of the cut and the wobble it opens to about that much. So it's easy to imagine, I need hardly mention or go into mathematical detail, that if it's then cut and caused the hole to be larger than the sword that you've thrust with, it's very easy to just take it back out again. So not only does a sharp edge around and a good tip allow for the sword to thrust and cause more damage on the entry. It also makes it easier to retract, and this is something I love doing in test cutting, because if you've got a sword that's not kind of too stuck, if the sword is getting really stuck, then I find when I'm doing a test cutting, it gets stuck in the item, I've got to kind of hold on the item, which makes it look like it's not very good, because someone could swing swords around and do all kinds if it was a real battle or something in the first place, and then go and pull back out, and then maybe I try another follow-up or something. It doesn't look cool. When I've got a sword that does the cutting on the entry, on the other hand, I do the thrust, and I'm having to be careful because the target's about to slip its way out and fall down anyway. I then retract and have enough time to potentially do a follow-up cut. I'll admit, usually the target falls faster than I react, and I might sort of swing at the air, but nonetheless there are times when I've done the thrust, I retract, cut, and it's beautiful, because there's nothing that looks better in test cutting apart from the obvious how nice of a cut or thrust you've done in the first place. One of the juiciest and most beautiful looking things at cutting bottles or tatami mats is when you're able to do follow-ups. It's not just, here's a target, I do a cut, there's the target, I do another cut, there's the target, I do a thrust. It's more like, there's a target, cut, thrust, cut, cut. You know, that follow-up, that fluid motion, and a sword should encourage fluid motion, not be hindered by the idea of it. The sword should be helping you, not you fighting. You know, you're fighting with the sword against a target. You shouldn't be fighting the sword itself. Let me think what else. Yes, so with things like fittings and pommels, I realise I have gone on for a long time, but hey, that's life. When you're doing things like fittings, such as crossguards and pommels on swords, you should bear in mind the weight. So, of course, if you've got, let's say, 2 pounds, and I noticed this actually with my archer's sword, which was the first sharp sword I ever had. It was an 18th birthday present. So it was 3 pounds overall. So it seems like, I noticed because after a long while of usage and during the video when I test cut of it, the pommel fell off. And the weird bit is, although I was a bit worried that it might try to slip out of my hand because there's nothing on the bottom anymore, the handling significantly improved. So apart from, you know, if they actually had something to stop my hand from slipping out, the sword got better by losing its pommel. Now that, as you can imagine, is a bad sign in a sword. If the sword handles better when it's falling apart, that's not good. So the reason being, I felt it in my hand, the pommel separately, and it was about £1 in weight by itself. It was probably, I mean, obviously this hammer's about £2 in weight, but it felt, you know, I was feeling it in my hand, I thought it feels kind of like that. It's a big, lumpy weight by itself. So the entire time it was attached to the sword, although the sword blade actually was quite good for a hefty chop. Whenever I swung with the sword, it felt like my force was staying in my hand. I had this object, it was a heavy sword, it's 3 pounds, which I can't remember what it converts to in kilograms, but a heavy sword like that really lends itself, you know, supposedly, to chopping and such things. But yet, every time I swung it, it felt like the force was staying in my hand and it wasn't going into the thing I was trying to destroy. So the big problem was, the pommel was so heavy that although the blade was perfectly fine, you know, it was, I mean, I'd have problems with the sharpness and the actual material and all that, but in terms of its overall shape and size, it was great actually. But yet, the problem was, although it had maybe 2 pounds or something of weight in the blade, there was about £1 of weight in the pommel, and because it was a sword that it kind of a bit more gradually tapered towards the tip, which again is not a bad design, it was broader towards the bottom, it had a little bit of a taper upwards, and then it suddenly triangulated to that spear point. It's a good design of blade, but when it had its heavy, bulky pommel attached, the problem was, it then became so back-weighted that whenever I swung it, the force stayed in the hand and it wasn't hitting a target. if you're doing blacksmithing and you want a bit of an anagram of, you know, a bit of an idea, not anagram, an analogue of what it's like, hold your hammer upside down, you swing like that. So if I take a stick, I've probably got a stick around here somewhere. Yes, I have. So here's a stick. So it's got its weight. If I take the stick and I swing it, I can feel a certain degree of force going towards the target. If I have the same stick, obviously it's not the same stick, but bear with me. If I have a stick, but then I have a heavy weight behind my hand, or around where my hand is, suddenly you can feel that whenever you swing it, no matter how strong I am, no matter how hard I swing this hammer, because of course the hammerhead is down here, I feel like if I had this stick on its own, it would almost be like a policeman's truncheon, and I could beat someone very badly with it. Yet when I hold it like this, and it's got this hammerhead underneath it, honestly, I would struggle to wound a child with this. It really is a significant difference. That it's got heavier, which in video game and, you know, sort of armchair swordsman kind of idea, that means if it's heavier, it does more damage. But yet, no. This handle, because it's now got the weight underneath it, it doesn't swing properly anymore, and I can try to sort of, you know, I'm using the wrist, or maybe I'm doing a bit more of my elbow, or maybe I'm putting my whole body behind it, but no matter what way I swing it, like you'd expect to, it just doesn't work. Kind of like Todd Howard's games. You can think that it just works, but it really doesn't. So hence, with things like swords, you should always bear in mind that yes, a good pommel can help with counterbalancing, but how far do you want to counterbalance it? It helps if you've got a hefty sword and you want something to help ease it back. So like I mentioned earlier, it's got more presence in the bottom half, so you can do things like parrying better, and it also feels a bit more nimble in the hands, and it doesn't feel like it wants to carry you away off into the sunset like it's some sort of differently shaped axe. But if you do it too far in the other direction, it's equally a problem. In fact, I would argue more of a problem. If you have a sword that's overweight, if you have a sword that's overweight in its forward, you can still inflict massive injuries with it. You can do a serious load of harm with it, even if it is very unwieldy. So it's a bad sword, but it's not the worst sword. Whereas a sword that's exceptionally back-weighted, it's got most of the problems of being heavy anyway, but you've also got the problem that the weight isn't translating into anything cool. It's not, you know, the weight isn't turning it into something more lethal. It doesn't hit harder. It doesn't beat something aside better. It doesn't strike someone through a parry better. It's just dead weight. It's just this, it's like you've got a ball and chain attached to your arm, and every time you want to swing your sword, you're being held back. And you don't want that. That's not a good handling of a sword. So as much as, I think I touched on it earlier, but as much as things like the wood in a handle doesn't really factor much at all. Like I had this very thicker and bulkier, I even had some blades which had very sort of bulky bits of wood on them, and I actually then shaved them back for handling purposes, because of getting my hand wrapped around it. But in terms of the weight, it did practically nothing to the sword. So that should be something to bear in mind. Until you get down to a scale like the small sword, where they're weighing it in the little teeny grams and grains and all that kind of stuff, most of the time things like wood and carbon fibre and those things on a handle don't have much of an effect. But you shouldn't let your guard down, pardon the pun about guards and pommels, but you shouldn't let your guard down and have things like the cross guard or a basket hilt or a pommel bring the weight so much back that your sword doesn't work as one anymore. So yeah, that's that. I think I've talked enough about making swords and how they can end up being good. I'm losing daylight at this rate because it's winter in Britain, and I should probably get started on forging a sword, which I meant to do ages ago. So that's that. It's nearly an hour long. If you've made it this far, you can comment that this video was probably nearly 57 minutes long, or even just yeah, comment the number 57, that's my usual thing, just so I know who actually watched it and who's commenting, because they have something to say on the internet. So, cheers, and I will talk for a long time another time. Bye.